One thing, even though she's the president, she forgot to tell you. We are setting up our first program for next year, which we think will be a presentation by Stuart Garrett on the status of sage grouse, which is a complex issue, both legal and biological in the high desert, and that'll be in next September sometime. So we're kind of looking forward to that as well. So before I became a member of the board of the fans group, I was on the board of the Friends of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. I had the privilege of being on that board during the occupation of our wildlife refuge. And during that period of time, I became aware of the Northern Paiutes, who are known in that community as the Burns Paiute. They call themselves the Wadatika. The Paiute are made up of about 24 bands, all named after their primary source of food. The Paiute who lived here, right on this ground, were called I don't know the Paiute name, but they were the mule deer eaters. Wada tika. Tika is a seed, or wada is the seed, a small black seed that can be made into a flower that grew around Malheur Lake. And that was their primary food. And during the takeover, I just want you to know, there was a protest every Saturday at the Narrows outside the Wildlife Refuge. And there were 2 human beings who showed up to every single protest. And that takeover began in January, right after January the 2nd. Sometimes horizontal snow. And that was the chairman of the Burns Paiute tribe and her sergeant at arms. So they were the staunchest defenders of our public lands. And really gendered for me a level of respect and curiosity. And subsequent to that, we invited one of them to join our board, and Jarvis Kennedy, the sergeant at arms for the tribal council, joined our board, and we were doing tours for our members after the takeover was over. And we were up at the lookout. Are you all familiar with the Malheur Wildlife Refuge? And we were up at the lookout, and our board chair was doing the geology talk, like there's a lake, there's a hill. That's not very sophisticated geology. But then he turned to Jarvis, and we hadn't cleared this with Jarvis yet. And he said, Jarvis, you want to tell us about your people here? And he was quite a shy man. And he seemed a little taken back, and he stood silently. And he said this, I want you all to close your eyes. And when you open them, I don't want you to see the buildings down there that are now the Wildlife Refuge headquarters and maintenance buildings. But I want you to see this. 15 smoke trails rising in front of wickiups from cooking fires. Women walking out across that wetland to gather tules to make mats and baskets. Men going over that hill with their rabbit nets to catch rabbits. And he painted a picture of the life those people lived on that land, that very land, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I once confronted Amon Bundy, and I said, look, if you want to go back to the way it was, let's just give it to the Paiutes. He said, I don't want to go back that far. So David's going to tell us what happened between them living on that land and them standing up for that land later, and how it came about that they were, well, he'll tell you the story. So, David Wilson.
Well, thank you, Chris, and I'm delighted by this turnout. This is terrific. It's an amazing story, tragic story, but it's a story that especially Oregonians need to know and tell their kids and their cousins and uncles, because the wrong that was done to these people makes most atrocities to Indians pale. So,
Do you have enough light?
No.
Okay. So, we didn't turn a forward lifestyle.
You notice I stopped talking just when. So,
There you go.
Is that okay?
yeah, let's see if this,
Just need to wake up the computer.
there we go, yeah. No, it's coming.
There you go.
All right. Okay. So the Northern Paiutes in southeast Oregon were a hardy, self-sufficient people who could make a living on land that is high desert. It doesn't grow a lot and doesn't nourish a lot, but they knew how to make a living from that land over many, many, many generations. Until about 1850, when things started to change. And we have a measure of how drastic the change was by a report in 80 years later in 1932. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs sent this man, Henry Rocloud, to investigate the circumstances of the Paiutes. Henry Rocloud, at this point, had 2 degrees from Yale. He was a ho-chunk. He had deep knowledge of the condition of Native Americans across the country. So what he said about the Paiutes comes from a man who knows. Among his findings, and these are quotations, the Paiutes were living in the dump, eating out of garbage cans. This is a picture taken, I believe, in 1919 of Old Camp, which was the dump in Burns where they were living. They were vermin infested, liable at all times to typhus fever, living in filthy rags, contracting trachoma and tuberculosis, going blind and dying. They are, quote, the most destitute we have in the United States. So this was just our neighbors, the most destitute in the United States. The cause of their decline from a hardy, self-sufficient people to this state is not hard to find. It's the Bannock War that was fought in 1878. But knowing that it's the Bannock War doesn't tell you very much. You need to know what the Bannock War was about to know who was at fault. So the United States was one party to the Bannock War, Oregon Paiutes and Bannocks from Idaho were the 3 parties to that war. There are about, when I started working on this, there were about 15 histories that touched on the Bannock War. And these histories were pretty much unanimous that the war was instigated by the Indians and principally by the Paiutes, because their main chief, Egan, was the leader of the fighting. And the collapse of the Paiutes into poverty was therefore essentially their own fault. So I spent a lot of years looking into this, and even though I'm not a historian, and I'd never written a book, and I've never studied Indians before, so I didn't want to be wrong on what I concluded, because I knew that people would say, who is this guy? So I spent a long, long time before I came out with my findings that the Paiutes were not the villains of the Bannock War, but they were the victims of that war. And that's essentially what I'm going to tell you about. I'm going to start with a Paiute woman that many have probably heard of, Sarah Winnemucca. She was the daughter of Chief Winnemucca. Let's see it. This is Sarah, and that's her father. And her father is the son of Chief Truckee. And Chief Truckee believed in befriending the whites, and he taught that to his people, even after his grandson was murdered and other atrocities continued. He continued to preach friendship with the whites. And he was probably, therefore, the one who sent Sarah and her sister to the home of settlers in in Nevada, who took the kids in and taught them English. And Sarah took to English. She soon became the translator for the army that hired her at Camp McDermott. And while she was at Camp McDermott, she wrote a letter to the commander, Henry Douglas. The letter was written in beautiful prose, and it mapped out the rational, simple course that the army should follow to make bring the Paiutes into white society and have them flourish and integrate with white society. It's so simple and logical the way she described it that her letter was passed up from level to level, and eventually it was published in Harper's Weekly. But although people admired it, nothing was done, at least not at that time. In 1873, the Malheur Reservation was created northeast of Burns. It was a huge reservation. And although it was desert, it had many resources, and it was on the Paiutes' native land. They were happy to have a reservation there. And even more amazing, they had a wonderful agent, Samuel Parrish, who going the wrong way, who admired the Paiutes and was a capable leader, and they grew to admire him. And they had a promising future with him in the saddle. They also had a chief, a remarkable chief, Egan. Egan's early years we have only one source on, which is not particularly reliable, but it's the only source we have. And what it says is that he was a Cayuse, and that is true. And his family was with a number of Cayuse families in the Blue Mountains when a band of Wisers, or I think it's Weezers, attacked, killed all the adults, stole the children, and took them back to their camp and raised them, made them part of their family. Egan flourished. He was a wonderful athlete, fisherman, hunter, leader. And he married Chief Shenka's sister, became a chief himself, and joined with Shenka in the Snake War. I haven't mentioned that before. The Bannock War was in 1878, and that's the main subject of my talk. But there was one other war 10 years earlier, the Snake War, which was a horrific war in which Shenka died. I'm not going to tell you details about this war, but the slaughter of Paiutes in surprise dawn attacks, time after time for 3 years, was unmerciful, and it was by far the worst atrocities the Paiutes had ever experienced in the lives of the people who experienced it and in the tribal histories. And we'll come back to that. Chief Egan was a witness to what happened on these attacks. He saw the whites' superior numbers and their weapons, and he saw the Paiute blood flowing. And they converted him. He had been a warrior. They converted him to a man of peace. We have his words spoken when he arrived at the Malheur Reservation. They were recorded by the son of the agent. And he said he wanted to live his life out in peace, and that it was time for the red man and the white man to eat bread together. His words were recorded by his niece Maddie as well, also words of peace. So in 1878, 5 years after the reservation was formed, the Bannock War broke out. It began when, I got my pointer here. Can't get along without that.
Do you need a glass of water or anything?
Not yet, thank you.
Just let us know.
Okay, I will. Okay. So the Bannocks had many valid grievances, and from their reservation, which was farther east. But they did not respond rationally. They decided to make war and to start a general Indian uprising. And about 200 Bannocks crossed over the Snake River on June 2, 1878, making their way toward Steens Mountain. And of course, here's the Malheur Reservation where the Paiutes were. By the time the Bannocks were maybe halfway across, on June 5, one of the most puzzling events and the cause of the confused history occurred. All 543 Paiutes picked up and left that day, and within 24 hours, the reservation was empty. They went to the Malheur River. Here's Steens Mountain. And this is a section of the Malheur River. I don't think it's the right section, but. And so, but let me go back to the map. And so as the Bannocks made their way across to Steens Mountain, the Paiutes went to the river here, and after a couple of days, they turned south and went to Steens Mountain, arriving at about the same time that the Bannocks arrived. While they are on, now the relationship between the Bannocks and the Paiutes is complicated. And there was clearly friction, as well as friendliness. But when a number of Paiutes were taken prisoner and to Steens Mountain, among them were Chief Egan and Chief Winnemucca. They were both being held captive on Steens Mountain.
By the Bannocks?
By the Bannocks. And by the way, I welcome questions at any time, so don't hesitate.
Why did they leave the reservation, the Paiutes, in the first place?
That is the big question, and I'm gonna answer it later. So Sarah Winnemucca learned that her father was captive, and she rode to the mountain with two other Paiutes and in secrecy, found her father and others, and they escaped and went back to the camp of the General Howard, who was leading the American troops. Sarah fought, was the scout for Howard, and fought on the side of the whites in this war. So the what was I going to say? Okay, we'll go on. I'll come back to it. So from after Winnemucca was rescued by his daughter, the rest of the Indians, both Paiutes and Bannocks, went north to the Umatilla Reservation. That took about 3 weeks. There were several battles along the way, but the purpose of this flight was to bring the Umatillas into the ranks of a general Indian uprising. But of course that didn't work out. A battle was fought on the Umatilla Reservation. The Indians lost, and the war was over. The Paiutes were, the Bannocks who were captive were taken to various forts and kept in for about a year. And there were, about 200 of them. The 543 Paiutes were all taken into captivity and marched up to the Yakima Reservation, where they were imprisoned for 4 years, even though the Bannocks were the true instigators of this war. So Sarah went to Yakima and saw the condition of the Paiutes there, and they were mistreated by the Yakima Indians and by the agent there. And Sarah wanted them to do what she could for them. And so after her pay arrived for her work as the scout for General Howard, she rented what is probably the largest performance hall in San Francisco, 3 stories high, a full city block. No. This is the hall this Indian maiden rented, and then sent out advertisements that she was going to speak about the mistreatment of her people. That's the most amazing thing to me. And what's even more amazing is that she was a dynamic and speaker who put the audience at ease. And the audience was pretty tiny at first, but word got out that this is really a show. And more people showed up. The press went wild over her, and word spread across the country, 3,000 miles, and reached Washington, D.C. As a result, the Carl Schurz, who was Secretary of Interior, invited Sarah, her father, and 2 other Paiutes to come to Washington, D.C. And they did, and they were put up in a hotel. Sarah charmed the reporters, and they went all aflutter over her in the press. And to give you an idea of her skill with the English language, she persuaded the Secretary of Interior, Carl Schurz, to give the Paiutes everything that she asked for in the letter she wrote back in 1970, the letter that was published in Harper's Weekly. He granted all of those things, including private, that they'd go back, they'd be freed from Yakima, they would have the right to live on the reservation, and they would be given separate parcels of land. They'd be trained in using the land and be given support. All of that was theirs. And the promise for the Paiutes from Scherz's commitments opened a bright future for the Paiutes, which of course was stolen by white liars who told Scherz that Sarah had duped him, that everything she was telling him were falsehoods. And Scherz was duped, there's no question about it, but not by Sarah. He was duped by these white men, and you can see each one proven in my book. I'm not going to go through it here, but these are not debatable lies. These are outright lies. And so what she won from Scherz with her eloquence was stolen by liars. And so they were not freed from Yakima, and they stayed there 4 years. And the reason they were never freed, but the agent there finally retired. And when he retired, the Paiutes, who'd been trying to escape for 4 years and constantly being run down, now nobody chased them anymore. And so they were able to disperse. And they did to a variety of locations, but the biggest group went back to the Malheur Reservation area and fell into the poverty that Henry Rocloud found in 1932. So I'm going to turn at this point. Most of everything I've told you so far is history that I read when I started looking into this. And what I'm going to tell you about next is what I was able to find that was contrary to that history. So the newspapers and the histories all pretty much spoke with one voice. And coming back to your question, why did they leave? Well, all of the newspapers and the histories were pretty much unanimous that they left for the obvious reasons. I mean, the Bannocks went to the Steens Mountain, the Paiutes went to Steens Mountain. Clearly, this was all prearranged. And that's what everybody said, that this had been arranged in advance. And it did look that way. I believed that. But I was curious about Egan, because he had repeatedly been advocating peace. And his words were recorded by a variety of people. And he seemed, you can pick up through the pages of history a sense of the integrity of the people. You can't always, and I got the sense, and I kind of trusted it, but I wanted to be, that Egan was an honest man. I didn't have enough experience to really trust my judgment, but that's the way it seemed. And there was others on the other side that seemed untrustworthy, and I was dead right on them. But so I believed this history, but I thought maybe I could explain why Egan changed his mind from peace to war. And maybe I could add to the history by explaining that. But, sorry. I wish you people would turn your phones off. But as I worked on it, trying to find out why he changed, the more I worked, the more I began to doubt that he had changed. And there were some hints that the history I had read wasn't quite right. And one of the hints was that I followed, when the Paiutes were at Malheur, they had a number of leaders, 8 or 10. And I tracked everything I could find about where those leaders were on June 5, the day that all the Paiutes suddenly left. Well, there was only one of them was at the Malheur reservation. The other 6 or 8 were off doing all kinds of other things. Why would you plan a daring departure and attack and departure from your reservation that you planned for weeks and weeks and do it with all your leaders gone? It didn't make any sense. And the other thing that didn't make any sense is that these Paiutes, most of the ones who fled the reservation on June 5 had been there 10 years earlier in the Snake War, and they had seen their brethren, their children, their parents killed and slaughtered. Why would they unanimously go against the same enemy again? So it didn't make sense to me. But this created a problem because the Paiutes, I couldn't argue that the Paiutes didn't leave their reservation because they had left. So I had to come up with an explanation. Why did they leave if it wasn't to go to war? I had to find some other explanation, and I stumbled on a telegram in the military records that I thought might do it. The telegram said that Bannocks in early June came to the Malheur reservation and took all of the Paiutes' guns, threatened to burn their homes and steal their stuff. So I thought if that was a valid document, then I had my answer. But it was never cited in any histories. I never saw anybody pay any attention to it. So I knew just standing alone, that wouldn't do it. I needed something to back it up. Where did these so-called Bannocks come from that it did all this stuff? So I looked at the news accounts of the Paiutes the Bannocks who had come across from Idaho and to Steens Mountain. Because if some Bannocks had done this, that's where they would have come from. And I found in the news accounts that when they crossed the Snake, these 200 Bannocks split. 150 of them went to the Bannock River Valley. There were lots of cattle in that valley, and they needed cattle and horses for the long campaign in front of them. And they stole cattle and horses. But that was 150. There are 50 more unaccounted for. And then I found an account that in a small town in eastern Oregon, and I've forgotten to write the name down, a small group of Indians surrounded a home seeking guns and ammunition. And if you plot the course from the Snake to that home, to the Malheur Reservation, it's a straight line, and you plot the speed at which it went, they traveled, it would put these 50 Bannocks on the reservation on June 4, the day before the mass exodus. So now the pieces of the puzzle were coming together, because I had this telegram. The telegram said there were Bannocks, but didn't say where they came from, but now I had news reports which meshed with the telegram. They both said Bannocks, both said the Bannocks would be at the reservation, both said on June 4. The Paiutes fled to escape the Bannocks, not to fight. But I had more problems, because the agent at Malheur said that Egan was the leader of the fighters, and that didn't fit with anything I was saying. And this agent was on the premises, and he knew all these people. I mean, how can I contradict him? So, but I began looking at the news accounts, which said that the Paiutes had, that Egan and the Paiutes had led the war. And the first two news accounts were on June 15 and 18, I think. And I had never read them, but they sounded familiar. And I knew why they sounded familiar, because I had read this agent's reports, and what the agent said in his reports and what the Oregonian said were almost word for word. There was no disputing it, that the agent had planted these stories with the Oregonian, and they are filled with provable falsehoods. So the Oregonian was duped by this agent. So why does the agent care? I mean, well, he was an evil man. He was cruel to the Paiutes, and it was widely known that the Paiutes were afraid and feared and loathed him. And in fact, news reports later that summer accused this agent of doing exactly what he did. And he knew that he was going to be blamed for the Paiutes' participation in the war if he didn't find somebody else to take the blame, and that was Egan. Egan was his enemy for other reasons as well, so he had plenty of reasons. So, but there's another even bigger problem, although I got over that one, and that is General Howard. General Howard was in charge of the military throughout the entire war. All of the communications from officers and soldiers and so on, they all went through him. He knew more than anybody. And he said that Egan was the leader of the Paiutes in the war. And so that threw me for a loop, and I didn't really quite know what to make of it, but I found another letter.
Why did the Paiutes go to Steens at the same time? Why?
That's a great question.
Somewhere else.
That is a great question. And so I hope I can remember where I was. Oops. That took me a long time to figure out. That's General Howard there. Okay. I wanna go back to the map, here we go. So, answering that question requires a little more detail. So when I said that all the Paiutes congregated here, well, it was all of the rank and file. The leaders, Egan and others, when they left here, Egan and the other leaders went to a meeting in Barren Valley, that's Barren Valley there, with the Bannock leaders. And the idea of the meeting, the Paiute leaders thought that they were going to convince the Bannocks to give up their war and to have peace. The Bannocks leaders had no such plan, and that they believed, and probably properly, that if they gave up, the leaders would probably be lynched. So they were not about to give up. And so, okay, the question, what was it, your question again?
Why did
Yeah.
they go
Okay.
to Steens?
So, from here, the Paiute leaders, at this point, they believed that they could make peace with the Bannocks. And the reason I know that is because from here, they went to Barren Valley for that very purpose. They knew that the Bannock leaders would be there, and they were. So the leaders believed they could make peace, and the leaders sent the rank and file to Steens Mountain while the leaders went to Barren Valley. So the leaders thought, we're going to send our rank and file to Steens Mountain. And to get even farther into it, Chief Winnemucca believed that he had long wanted a reservation on the Owyhee. And he was told by a general that he had that reservation, that it was going to be created. And he was the principal impetus for the Paiutes going to Steens Mountain. And this would lead his people toward the reservation that the general had told him he had. And his people then could live there, which was what he wanted. So there are lots of pieces to the puzzle, but they all fit together. So that's why they kept on going to Steens Mountain. Now I have to remember where I was.
Did they know the Bannocks were going there too, the Steens,
Yes.
at that time?
Yep.
Wasn't there a complete, after the Civil War, all the soldiers moved out west, and they tried to, assist the pioneers that were walking out and stuff, and there was wasn't it a concerted plan to kill all of the Native Americans, that the generals that came out first in the 1860s, they did a thorough job of going back and forth across the Oregon and like you say, just ambushing and slaughtering these people.
Well, that was the war that preceded this one. That was the Snake War.
But it never ended.
The Snake War did. It ended in 1868, and I'm looking for. I have General Crook here.
Yeah.
General Crook came. He was a Civil War general, and in 1866, he came west and he took over the Snake War. And he was the one who slaughtered the Paiutes. Although he was, as generals go, he was better than most in terms of,
I understand he believed in winter campaigns and going to where they would destroy all their winter supplies and everything, and then, you know,
yeah,
assassinate everybody.
yeah.
You know, and that's why the Bannocks, I think, went on the, I mean, they couldn't take any more of it, getting, you know, no supplies and being treated, you know, in inhumane ways. How could a person react?
Well, they were, their losses in the Snake War were, there's a book called the I think something like The Bloodiest War in the West, and it's the Snake War against the Paiutes, and yeah, bloody beyond imagination.
You know, imagine.
I argue that the next war, the Bannock War, was worse, and I'll come to that. Well, I'll just say,
Thank you.
yeah, I'll just say right now that the number of natives shot in the Bannock War was not that many. There were only about 80 died in that war, whereas in the Bannock War, which is the second war, the first war, it's probably 500 or more. But the Bannock War was far worse because it put them into abject poverty from which there was no escape. They couldn't feed their children, they couldn't educate their children, they couldn't provide health for their children, and so things just spiraled downward, and they couldn't deal with the diseases, and so I mean, all of the victims of these things were victims of the Bannock War, which, you know, it is just horrifying in the extreme, and it's why I think, you know, it may be the worst atrocity of any. Although it, you know, not that much gunfire.
So David, you said that the Paiute chiefs were taken prisoner by the Bannocks at one point, and Sarah Winnemucca came and escaped them. When did that
Yeah,
happen
your
in
father.
that-
Yeah. Go ahead.
When did that happen in that sequence of events of the Paiute leaving the reservation, going to the Malheur, meeting with the Bannock chiefs?
It happened on Steens Mountain. So let me get the map back up here. Okay. So in Barren Valley is where Egan argued so furiously against the Bannock leaders that they finally imprisoned him and took him and Chief Winnemucca, took both of them to Steens Mountain, where everyone gathered. So does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, and it was then a couple of days later, General Howard's troops arrived. The Indians flee up this way, and you heard the rest.
And the General Howard, that's Howard University Howard.
Yes. So he's an interesting character we could spend a lot of time on, but yeah, he had a lot of good in him, but he got worse and worse as his life proceeded. So, and he's who I'm coming back to now, because I've overcome the agent's lies, but General Howard also said that Egan was the leader. And Howard had more information than any historian, than any other soldier. And so how are you going to deal with that? Well, I found a letter written in 1878 that said that it was not Egan who led the Paiutes, it was another chief by the name of Oites. Oites was the most bellicose, warlike of all the Paiute chiefs. But what interested me most about the letter was that I can't remember if I told you that the author was General Howard. So he's, of course, the one who later on in the books that he wrote 30 years later said that Egan was the leader. And of course, his memory probably didn't improve very much during the 30-year interval between the end of the war and the time he wrote these books. So that sent me to looking at the books. And I found them brimming with other lies, all of which were designed to make the Paiutes look weak and dishonest and unappealing, and to make him look heroic. And some of these are not arguable lies. I mean, some of them were contradicting something he himself wrote. So this is not subtle stuff. This guy was an out-and-out liar. And the Paiutes were out-and-out victims of this dishonesty that's been with us and has been our history for 143 years. So, before I wrap up, I have to go back to the end of the Bannock War, where it ended, and Umatilla warriors who wanted to ingratiate themselves with the whites went out and killed a dozen Paiutes, Egan among them. This was part of an effort by the Surgeon General, and then the Army medical, the Army physician removed Egan's skull and sent it back to Washington, D.C. to put on display in the Army Medical Museum. And this was part of an effort by the Surgeon General to prove that natives are inferior to whites because of difference in skull size. So there's no little irony in the U.S. attempt to enlist Egan's skull in an effort to show Indian inferiority, when Egan had at every turn tried to guide his Paiutes on a path of peace that would have been much more productive for the whites and for the United States had they listened to him. But no, instead they tried to prove themselves superior by displaying Egan's skull. So if the display showed anything, it was the inability of the whites to see beyond skin color to the true nature of another people. What it emphatically did not show was white superiority in any respect other than the use of brute force. So among the many wrongs exposed in this book is 143 years of false Paiute history, blaming innocent Paiutes, lauding guilty whites. The wrongs will never be righted, but the false accusations against Paiutes that fill our history books can be righted. And my hope is that this book will at least begin crediting Paiutes with a good name they have earned but never received. Now, before, one more thing I want to do is, I haven't mentioned Nancy Egan, who is the great-great-granddaughter of Paiute Chief Egan, and who has been a great help and has become a great friend to me in this process. And after the book was published, she invited many of her relatives to the museum in Boise, and I gave a talk there and met with many of her family, and I had a friend of mine who's a really good photographer take some pictures. And so, Nancy is in red right in the center with next to me, and my wife, that's my wife Nellie here, and I have the names of the others, but I don't have them in front of me, which I regret. But these are all family members, and we spent the day, we had lunch, and it's just a really cool day. And this is the eldest, I believe, surviving at that time. Here's Nancy talking. Okay, and this is a slide above Nancy of her, I can't remember, grandfather or great-grandfather, who was the oldest surviving Paiute at the time Egan's skull was returned for repatriation. And so Nancy was able to get it through her grandfather. So just a few more of these. She's so down. And this is a dress that is made, Egan stands for something pony, I can't remember, but this dress was made in celebration of Egan. Okay, that's the end, and I love questions, but I know people like to eat too, so. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Wilson Weewa is a member of the Northern Paiutes from that area. Do you have, has he been in any way involved in the work that you've been doing?
Yes. Yeah, we've met maybe 5 or 6 times, and he was quite reticent at the beginning, and properly so, because I didn't know anything, I had no credentials. But in time, I began to find some stuff. He was a wonderful help to me, but I began to help him a little bit. And so since then, he calls me friend. So that's been fun.
How are the tribe, how are they doing now in Burns? Are they still in poverty? My knowledge is historic. I don't know much about current. So I don't think there's nothing great, but they are a recognized federal tribe, and there has been, they've come a long way, but not nearly as far as they deserve to have come.
So how did they end up in Warm Springs?
So I can answer that a little bit. So when these people came back to Burns, the reason they lived in the dump is the same reason we see homeless people living here in unused strips of land and places they won't be bothered. And subsequent to that, some, I think a benefactor in Burns area, right after World War I, bought a bunch of used army tents and gave them, and then that gave them a little better housing, but they were still living in the dump in Burns. When they were federally recognized, they got that land and some other land immediately around Burns. It's all northwest of town. You can drive out there and drive through. They have some pretty good infrastructure, a little healthcare out there, a nice meeting room. They have a casino somewhere in the area. They've been able to buy back pieces of land around, but that reservation you saw there is gone. So I would be surprised if they have 1 in 100 of those acres that they control.
Well,
They
that
have
was,
the same dilemmas. Jarvis, I think we're gonna get Jarvis to come here and do a presentation for us. My friend Jarvis who gave that description. Jarvis has been in prison. He's had some dilemmas. He's open talking about it, but it's challenging for these people. And they're really coming from nothing to somewhere. And that's all happened in the last 35, 40, 50 years.
What happened to the Bannocks? Are they still in existence?
I don't know. Should.
What was the significance of meeting up in the Steens Mountain area? Was that, seems like a remote area to launch a war from. Is that just a central location for all the tribes?
Spiritual.
Well, why did they meet on this occasion is the question.
Why did they meet at Steens at all? What was the meaning of Steens Mountains to the Northern Paiutes? Was it a?
Oh, well, it was highly, Winnemucca loved Steens Mountain. He retreated there multiple times. As for why this particular meeting was there, I believe that the meeting was, I think that Winnemucca was involved in setting the meeting up. And I have good reason for that. And so somehow, I don't know how the communication occurred between Winnemucca and the Bannocks, but they did want to meet, and that was the chosen spot. I have tried to find that spot, and I have a lead to it from a guy who says that all the signs are there, but I haven't gotten to the point yet. Yes.
Well, I was just wondering if history shows anything with Sarah. What happened to her?
Well, Sarah wrote a book, which I should have mentioned. It's, how many people who write about Indians get to read a book written by one of the people they're writing about, who experienced all these events. It's an amazing resource for me. But she lectured up and down the East Coast. She taught young Paiutes in the West Coast. She went to live with her sister somewhere, and I don't remember whether it was Wyoming, Montana, and she died of unknown cause. There are lots of people speculating, but she died, and the location of her grave is not known. A statue of her is in the nation's capital that was donated by the state of whatever, what's right? Nevada, yeah. So, and there is, if you're curious about, there is a book of things written by and about her, and it's about this thing. So, there's a lot.
Any other questions?
So, by the way, that reservation, Fort McDermott Reservation, it's another Paiute reservation, just discovered a huge deposit of lithium there. And so if you want batteries in your cell phone, you're not doing the Paiutes any favor. So that's another type of struggle they're having. And the Paiute, by the way, Wilson Wiwa is not a Wadatika. He's a mule deer eater. He told me this the other night. I just heard a presentation he gave. But they're very closely related as neighbors. And one, just a brief historical fact that may interest you. We sort of have this idea of the Paiute as relatively peaceful, maybe small bands, not one of the big powerful like Lakotas, Indian types. But until Custer, the battle at the Little Bighorn, a Paiute battle, 20 years before that, resulted in the highest number of American casualties until the Battle of Little Bighorn, and that was happening around Pyramid Lake. And the Paiute there had some daughters kidnapped and turned into prostitutes, and they went and got them back. And the white people there thought they deserved to be able to keep them, and they took off out to get them, and the Paiutes whipped them. And it was a big battle, an organized, powerful event that they were able to put on. So these were not all small band people. They had some larger bands as well. So let me thank David just a second. I want to tell you what you guys just saw. We're both lawyers. I am so glad he's not trying this case against me. And this is what lawyers do, just to get lawyers a little up here. You know, as we take a story that we are trying to prove in a courtroom, you're the jury, and we go through it and we figure out what are the questions they're going to ask. Why did they go down to that place? And we try and answer them in advance. And he has applied the best skill of a lawyer in truth finding to the history of the event he's trying to expose in the book he wrote. So I have a tremendous amount of admiration for what he's done. That's all.
All right, and if you are interested in the book, they're $35. Excuse me, and we'll take your money over there. And other than that,
All royalties go to the American Indian College Fund.
and we do offer a $100 honorarium to our speakers, and you specified that it goes to the American Indian. Okay, with that,
David's happy to sign your books if you buy one. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 left.
all right, thank you very much. That's all.
Sarah Hopkins read Maka's book